Arrows out. Annihilate. Yeah, ha.
Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Skirk guide. In today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Skirk, the newest 5-star cryo main DPS released in Genshin Impact. In fact, we're going to cover Skirk's best builds, artifacts, weapons, stats, team comps, constellations, as well as a dive into her optimal combos and different playstyles. This will be a complete guide of everything you need to know in one video. Before we begin, however, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and excuse the slight delay on this guide. I'll try to be earlier for the next ones, as well I did release a first impressions of Skirk from the creator experience server. A lot more effort went into this complete guide that was recorded after her release on the live servers. And so with all that out of the way, let's talk about Skirk. Alright, so starting things off, let's talk about what Skirk does. Firstly, I want to say that her kit is quite unique as a character who doesn't use energy and also has two distinct ways of being played. With that said, let's first start by talking about her abilities before getting into her actual playstyles. So firstly, for her elemental skill, this is an ability that you can tap or hold. To start with the tap form, Skirk will, upon pressing her skill, gain 45 stacks of Serpent Subtlety and enter the 7-phase flash mode. In this mode, or stance, Skirk will deal increased normal charge and plunge attack damage and also convert their damage to cryo. Outside of that, she will gain interruption resistance, and a bar to the left of her will appear, which will show off how many Serpent Subtlety stacks you have. These stacks will be drained at a rate of 7 per second, and when you run out of them, Skirk will exit her unique stance and her skill will end. While pressing her skill will give you 45 stacks, which will last you just under 6.5 seconds, Skirk's elemental skill can last up to 12.5 seconds, with the duration being extended as you can generate more Serpent Subtlety stacks by consuming Void Rifts. In fact, what these Void Rifts are a part of Skirk's first passive. As Skirk or her party members trigger cryo-related reactions, except Melt for some reason, a Void Rift will be created, and up to 3 Void Rifts can exist at once. Now, any cryo-related reaction except Melt means Frozen, Superconduct, Cryo Swirl, or Crystallize, and as you are triggering these reactions, these Void Rifts will appear, with Skirk being able to consume them in 3 different ways. Firstly, inside of her tap skill, for her first, normal attacking playstyle, there will be 2 ways, either by 1 using her charge attack, or by 2 using her special burst, both of which will consume all nearby Void Rifts and grant her 8 Serpent Subtlety points for each Void Rift consumed, up to a maximum of 3 at a time. Additionally, while her charge attacks are pretty straightforward, her Elemental Burst actually is quite unique. This is an ability that does not cost energy, and inside of her elemental skill, it actually won't do any damage and will have a short animation, consuming all nearby Void Rifts and increasing your Skirk's normal attack damage by an amount that will scale based on how many Void Rifts you absorbed. Now, while this damage bonus isn't the biggest thing, it's definitely nice and appreciated, so you typically want to use it early on in your rotation to maximize your normal attack damage and also extend the duration of your skill. Now, with that said, Skirk also has another form of her elemental burst that she can use. This is Skirk's burst outside of her elemental skill when she is not in her 7-phase flash mode, and it will require at least 50 Serpent Subtlety stacks. Once she has this many, she can expend all the stacks she has to unleash her elemental burst, which will deal a ton of AoE cryo damage. There'll be 5 initial slashes and then 1 final hit that will deal even more damage, with the scaling being quite high and getting significantly stronger the more points you have over 50, up to 12 additional points. What this means is that while you can use your burst at 50 points, if you have at least 62, you'll be doing as much damage as you can get. Now, the way to actually get the stacks will be by holding your elemental skill instead of tapping it, where Skirk will instantly gain 45 Serpent Subtlety points, as well as start sort of swimming in the air and moving around at high speed. This is nice for exploration and also, crucially, to get these Serpent Subtlety points fast without entering your skill and forcing you to use your other burst, as once again, inside of Skirk's skill, she cannot use her damage dealing burst, but instead only the one that will increase her normal attack damage instead. With that said, I also wanted to clarify the third way that Skirk can consume Void Rifts, which is by holding her elemental skill. When she does this, not only will she instantly gain the 45 points that I mentioned, but she will also consume any Void Rifts that were generated and get another 8 points per Void Rift. This means that if you hold your skill and consume 3 Void Rifts, she will instantly have enough Serpent Subtlety points to do the maximum damage out of her elemental burst, with 2 Void Rifts not being too far off, but 3 will cap it out. Additional things you should know about this burst and her skill are that inside of her tap skill, her Serpent Subtlety points will act as the meter for how long she can stay inside of it, with it constantly constantly draining every second and ending if you swap out of Skirk. This means that you can't get Serpent Subtlety points by tapping your skill and then swapping out and going back into her and bursting. However, if you hold your skill, the points you generate will stay on Skirk even if you swap out or anything, meaning that you can also use Skirk's hold skill to absorb Void Rifts and save up some stacks for a future rotation, or kind of keep them in the bank if you don't plan on using your burst right away. Outside of that, for some very important passive talents that Skirk has, outside of her first one, which we covered, Skirk also will gain incredible amounts of damage through these team restricting passive talents. In fact, one of her most important passives and a big part of her kit is going to be her second Ascension passive, which is part of the reason why basically every Skirk team revolves around the freeze reaction. What this passive will do is for each Hydro party member that deals Hydro damage or Cryo party member that deals Cryo damage, Skirk will gain 1 stack, with each character in your party only being able to give Skirk 1 stack, and she can't generate one herself. And what these stacks do is significantly increase Skirk's scalings for her normal attacks and burst damage. Crucially, you'll also notice that the third stack here, by running a full Cryo and Hydro team, or technically full Cryo, but you need reactions for her other passive, will grant her the biggest increase in scaling, going from 120 to 170% for her normal attacks, or 115 to 160% for her burst damage. And these increases in scalings are really big. They're not just a bit of damage bonus. It really will make her do a ton more damage. And so building your team around this is going to be highly recommended, and something we're going to touch on extensively in this video. This passive talent is a way of telling us that Skirk is designed to be a freeze DPS or her damage will suffer. Outside of that, Skirk also has a third passive talent, which typically is just for exploration, but for Skirk, it actually is there for damage. It will increase all of your party members' skill talent level by 1 if all party members are either Hydro or Cryo, and there's also at least 1 Hydro and 1 Cryo character in your team, once again being a passive talent activated in a freeze team specifically. This skill damage bonus is not only nice for Skirk as it increases her damage, but it's also great for other damage dealing sub DPSs you may be running, like Farina or Escoffier. And so as you've seen, Skirk is a character who, yes, will revolve around the freeze reaction, but will have 2 very viable and strong playstyles, but we'll touch on that in the playstyle section coming up next. And for her talent priority, this will vary based on how you choose to play her, with her skill being your #1 priority as a normal attacking main DPS, with her burst being the priority if you're using her as a burst damage dealer. Generally though, because Skirk can be very flexible in her playstyle, I would recommend leveling both her skill and her burst and ignoring her normal attacks, as even if you are normal attacking inside of her skill, it will have a different scaling than the ones that you get by leveling your normal attacks. So similarly to Child, you can ignore these and level your skill and your burst as the 2 only talents that matter. Now with that said, let's talk about Skirk's different playstyles, because she's a character that has nuance and can seem overwhelming at first. So firstly, let me say that Skirk has 2 main ways of being played, but in practice, she ends up being very flexible and versatile. In fact, you can use her either inside of her skill by tapping it and then using her enhanced burst to increase your normal attack damage, extend your skill's duration, and spam normal attacks on field. The other way to play her is to hold her skill to absorb the void rifts you generate by triggering cryo reactions, typically from your other characters, and then using your burst on Skirk, unleashing a big nuke of burst damage, and then swapping out of her, doing attacks on other characters, or quick swapping through your team. There's also more hybrid playstyles where you can kind of do a bit of both, and typically while both main playstyles are viable, what ends up happening is that in practice, regardless of how you're building your Skirk or your team, a lot of the times what is best to do will depend on the enemies you're fighting and the content you're doing. For example, if an enemy is low HP, even if you're planning on playing Skirk as a normal attacker, well, you could just use your burst to finish them off, whereas sometimes doing normal attacks to maybe finish off an enemy and then still have DPS uptime for the next wave of enemies can be more beneficial. With that said, because of how many normal attacks Skirk can get in a rotation, typically the quote-unquote standard way to play her will be as an on-field normal attacker, but in many teams, as I said, you can also use her more for her burst, or if that's just something you enjoy. With that said though, as I mentioned, I really do believe it's optimal to have this flexibility and kind of alternate playstyles depending on what you're doing. Skirk has what I've been calling vibes-based rotations, where if you start in Abyss Chamber with your burst stacked up, you can use your burst for damage and also tap your skill to normal attack as well. You can hold your skill while an enemy is invulnerable or low HP to pre-stack your next rotation. There are ways to get supercharged front-loaded rotations, making Skirk's optimal rotation very heavily based on the content you're doing, giving her the advantage of flexibility even within the same team comp, having more room to get more value based on what you're fighting. So if you want my full thoughts on Skirk and a review of the character, do check out my last video. But to summarize in a sentence, Skirk is a character who's incredibly powerful but also very restrictive. She's someone whose passives essentially force you to play a freeze team, and even inside of the freeze team, one specific character, Escoffier, will contribute a massive team DPS increase, which which makes the gap between Skirk's Escoffier teams and Escoffia teams much bigger than what we're used to, even compared to other characters, because it's harder to replace a res shredder and healer like Escoffier because of Skirk's team building restrictions, forcing you to play cryo and hydro units, and because of how efficient Escoffier is at being a 3-in-1 incredible support who does damage, shreds resistances, and gives healing. With that said, I do want to mention in this video that even without Escoffier, Skirk's teams still perform well and she's still a good DPS. She just goes from being, say, a top 3 or a meta tier character, at least at the time of her release, to a DPS that's still good, but not quite as groundbreaking. Personally, I'm a big fan of Skirk's gameplay, but I am also critical of the nature of her team building restrictions. With that said, don't feel forced to get this character, but if you are looking for a DPS and like her design and or gameplay, then she definitely will be strong enough, especially if you invest into her and her team, where she can be one of the strongest carries. Now, for some more in-depth advice for combos and actually figuring out how to use her, here's what you should know. Firstly, as a main DPS normal attacker, the standard and easy rotation to not break anyone's brains and keep things very simple will be to use her skill, then use her burst, and then do as many 5 normal attack strings as you can, typically doing 5 normal attacks twice, and then a charge attack to consume the void rifts you generated throughout your rotation, and then another 2 strings of 5 normal attacks. Keep in mind that there are some advanced things you can do, like dash canceling your charge attack, and you can even weave in some normal attacks, for example, weaving one in between your skill and your burst to get a bit of extra hits. For the most part, you can just spam your normal attacks though, and it will perform well, with Skirk wanting to use her burst near the start to consume void rifts and buff her normal attacks, and then doing a charge attack in the middle to consume more void rifts and extend the duration of her skill. Additionally, for a rotation that's a bit more advanced, this is one where you're still going to be spamming N5, but animation canceling your 5th hit with your burst instead of using it immediately after your skill, then doing 2 more N5s, then an N3C, meaning 3 normals into a charge attack, then you're dash canceling as early as possible, and then finishing off 1 more combo. If your timing's off, you may only get an N4 at the end, which is fine, but there's definitely room for optimization to finish your final attack string. Outside of that, if you do have your burst available at the start of your rotation, for example, you're starting an Abyss Chamber, or use your hold E to consume void rifts, you can do a supercharge rotation where you can use Skirk's burst after swapping into her immediately before using your skill, then you tap your skill and spam normal attacks using your charge attack once enough void rifts are generated before your skill ends to extend its duration. As mentioned, you lose out on a bit of buffs this way, but it really isn't much compared to the damage you're gaining from your burst. Lastly, for a burst playstyle, all you need to do on Skirk is hold your skill after void rifts have been generated, so after you've used all your support characters, then use your burst, do as much damage as you can, and then you can swap out and either quick swap through your characters or even use another DPS. I also wanted to point out that Skirk can do some hybrid rotations that can work in practice, where you'll use a few abilities on your characters, use your Skirk's hold E and burst, then swap back through your supports during your skill's cooldown, going back to your Skirk, then using her skill and spamming normal attacks. Additional things I wanted to point out are that you can tell how many void rifts you have by the little glowing stars next to your bar, and also do make sure to swap through all of your support characters before going into your Skirk, regardless of your playstyle, so that you trigger her passive by doing elemental damage on all of your hydro and cryo characters, and also setting up your buffs so that when your Skirk takes field, she can do as much damage as possible. Do also note that if you're running an attack speed buffer like Dahlia or Mika, Skirk will get extra normal attacks in her rotations, which actually makes them more viable supports than you might expect. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Skirk. Now keep in mind that because Skirk has different playstyles, her exact build can vary based on this playstyle, which will be factored into the recommendations I give in the coming sections, and we'll talk about the differences in how you're building her based on your playstyle. With that in mind, there is a lot of overlap with the builds being very similar, but there are some differences artifact and weapon wise that I will highlight. And so firstly, for Skirk's artifact sets, here's what you need to know. For this character in particular, there are actually 2 main sets that you can choose from, being Finale of the Deep Galleries, her quote-unquote signature set, and 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter if you are playing her with Farina. Now, to first talk about her signature set, this one will give her 15% crowd damage bonus on the 2-piece, and then when the equipping character has 0 energy, which Skirk will always have, she will have 60% normal attack damage bonus and 60% elemental burst damage bonus, with only one of these really being active at once, because once you do normal attack damage, you will lose the burst damage buff for 6 seconds, and vice versa, if you do burst damage, your normal attack damage bonus for 6 seconds. What this means in practice is that this set, depending on your Skirk's playstyle, will either buff her normal attacks or her burst, with it giving you 60% damage bonus from the 4-piece, and then another 15% crowd damage bonus to your entire kit through the 2-piece. This set will give you a lot of stats, but something to note is that the Marechaussee Hunter set, which is one that will give you up to 36% crit rate, as well as 15% normal and charge attack damage bonus from the 2-piece, is an incredible option as well if your HP is constantly changing, meaning if you have Farina in your team. Now, as far as which artifact set is better, here's what you should know. Firstly, for a normal attacking Skirk, the Marechaussee Hunter set will typically be slightly better than the Finale Finale with Farina in most cases. This is because the stats you gain are just so high that if you're not overcapping on crit rate, you can get more value out of the Marechaussee Hunter set. Now, it is worth pointing out that this set does have some drawbacks, like not only chaining your Skirk to Farina, although they definitely synergize well with one another, but outside of that, the fact that you're gaining 36% crit rate can make building your Skirk a bit more tricky if you already have a crit rate weapon, and may even get additional crit rate through something like the Cryo Resonance, although the uptime on that isn't the greatest against non-freezable targets, but more on that when we talk about artifact stats. For the most part though, Skirk with Farina will appreciate Marechaussee Hunter, and as I said, it'll typically be slightly better than Finale of the Deep Galleries, just as far as stats are concerned for a normal attacking Skirk. It's also worth pointing out that the Finale set does not buff Skirk's charge attack damage, whereas Marechaussee Hunter will, which does also help it in that regard. On the flip side, if you're playing a burst DPS Skirk, then Finale of the Deep will definitely be better, because Finale just gives you so much damage bonus for free. Now with that said, I think that Finale of the Deep is going to be the most generalistic set for different playstyles across different teams, a set made for Skirk that you can farm for her and it will be pretty consistent. I do however want to add that Marechaussee Hunter is an artifact set that's been out for a long time in a very efficient domain, and that's also strong boxable and really good on many different DPS characters, notably if you have Farina on your account. For those reasons, farming the Marechaussee domain may be more efficient for you, and there's a good chance that you may have already farmed it, already have a good Marechaussee Hunter set, which can make it to where farming a brand new domain, a brand new artifact set just for your Skirk, especially if you don't want the other Long Night's Oath set that comes along with it, may not be worth it for you. And so in those situations, running the Marechaussee Hunter set, which can actually be slightly better if you have Farina and are using Skirk as a normal attacker, will be more efficient, whereas Finale of the Deep will be a bit more of a generalistic option. Both are great, with Finale of the Deep Galleries being more generalistic in my opinion, but Marechaussee being a nice, efficient set you can use, especially for a normal attacking Skirk if Farina is in your team and you're not overcapping on crit rate. With that said, for alternative artifact sets, here's what you should know. Firstly, 4-piece Blizzard Sphere can technically be your best in slot against enemies that are frozen. If this is the case, you'll gain 40% crit rate and 15 crowd damage bonus, which will make it your best in those scenarios, but keep in mind that a lot of the hard content in this game is against bosses that can't be frozen, and against unfreezable enemies, this set loses a lot of value, and while it will still be a viable alternative if you don't have Finale or Marechaussee, it won't be as good. Outside of that, for other viable sets you can run if you don't have her best ones, 4-piece Vermilion can technically work with Farina for either playstyle if for some reason you have that but not Marechaussee Hunter, and for a normal attacking Skirk, both 4-piece Glad for damage bonus and attack, or 4-piece Desert Pavilion for normal and charge attack damage bonus and some attack speed which will help you get extra hits, can work as well. Keep in mind that these sets won't be as good as her main two best in slot sets, but can work as alternatives that'll typically be around 10% or so behind. Alright, now with the artifact sets out of the way, for Skirk's artifact stats, it's much more straightforward. In fact, because she's a character who doesn't need energy recharge and can ignore elemental mastery as well because you're playing her in freeze, the stats you're looking for are just going to be crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent. These stats you should look for on all of your pieces as the best substats for maximizing your Skirk's damage. Also, as always, be sure to balance your crit rate to crit damage ratio, aiming for 1:2 crit rate to crit damage when factoring in external crit rate buffs you may be getting, such as the 36% from the Marechaussee Hunter set if you choose to run it. Outside of that, I also wanted to mention the 15% crit rate you can get from the Cryo Resonance against enemies that are affected by Cryo. Do keep in mind though that this can be somewhat inconsistent depending on the enemies you're fighting. In fact, this crit rate buff will have good uptime against frozen targets, whereas against unfreezable boss enemies, its uptime will be worse and will vary based on your elemental application. You'll have a lot better uptime in a triple Cryo team where you don't have the most Hydro application versus in a double Hydro team with 2 fast Hydro appliers. This means that the relevancy of the Cryo Resonance buff will vary based on the targets you're fighting, whether or not they're freezable, and also the team that you're running based on your Cryo application. For those reasons, whether you choose to factor this 15% crit rate or not is up to you, depending on the team and the content that you're doing, but I at least wanted you to be aware of it. As for your main stats are concerned, Skirk wants an attack percent sans, a crit rate or crit damage circlet, whichever one you need more of, and either cryo damage bonus or attack percent on your goblet. Generally, I'd say cryo damage is your go-to option and the best generalistic choice. With that said, there are situations where an attack percent goblet can be very comparable or slightly better. This is because Skirk is a character who doesn't have too many attack buffs from her kit and team and can get a lot of damage percent, especially if you are running the Finale of the Deep Galleries 4-piece. If that's the case and you also have other damage buffers like maybe Farina, a scroll user, or a weapon that gives you a lot of damage percent, then an attack percent goblet can actually be a bit better for your Skirk. With that said, if you are running a weapon that gives you a lot of attack percent like Finale of the Deep, the weapon not the artifact set, or even her signature weapon Azurlight, or have a good amount of external attack buffs in your team through artifact sets, or are running another set that doesn't give you damage percent like Marechaussee Hunter, which we talked about extensively, where your Skirk will no longer have this much damage given to her for free, then a cryo goblet will go back to being better. And so for those reasons, a cryo damage bonus goblet and an attack percent goblet can both be good for you depending on what forms of damage percent and attack percent your Skirk is gaining. Generally, I'd say cryo damage bonus will be the standard option, but attack percent can be very viable as well, especially if you have good substats, so you can choose based on your team, artifact set, weapons, and also which goblet your account has that is better. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Skirk's best weapons. Now something to point out here is that Skirk has both an amazing 5-star signature weapon and also a ton of other good stat sticks, including a really strong free-to-play option, meaning that she has a good weapon for every type of player. Also, do note that both of Skirk's playstyles will be considered in this section, and there will be a weapon ranking in this section to help every type of player. Firstly, Azure Light is her signature weapon that comes with an effect that's incredible for Skirk. In fact, it's a weapon with a very high base attack, 22% crit rate, and an effect that will give the equipping character 24% attack after using their skill. But afterwards, if the equipping character has no energy, she will gain 24% attack and 40% crit damage during this time. What this means in practice is that for Skirk, you will just get a ton of stats, 48% attack, 40% crit damage, as well as having a high base attack and 22% crit rate, making this weapon very strong for Skirk. While the second part of the effect obviously is more niche if you're looking for just a sword for your overall account, Skirk definitely makes the most out of it. And so because of all the stats you're getting, this weapon will typically be around a 20 to 30% damage increase to your Skirk compared to free-to-play options. And while it's definitely a great option for Skirk, it's not one that is required because there are some other great options that we're going to talk about as well. Firstly, for other 5-star stat sticks, Haran can be great, especially for a main DPS normal attacking playstyle, but be careful not to overcap on crit rate. Similarly, with Jade Cutter, a weapon that actually will give you even more crit rate than Haran, this is a great stat stick for any sword user, Skirk included, but it will prevent you from running the Maréchaussée Hunter set, as you really want to be sure not to go over 100% crit rate. Outside of that, Mist Splitter is also incredible for Skirk, as you can fully stack it up for a main DPS playstyle, and it's a weapon that has a high base attack, good crit damage, and then more damage on its effect. Typically, outside of your signature weapon, these three, Haran, Mist Splitter, and Jade Cutter, will be your three next best 5-star options. Outside of that, you can also use Absolution or Uraku Misugiri as fine stat sticks that are a bit worse. And Summit Shaper can technically be viable as well as a big attack stat stick if you're running a shield character. Outside of that, for some 4-star options, firstly, let's talk about Skirk's amazing free-to-play choices. Firstly, Finale of the Deep is an incredible stat stick for Skirk. This is because, as I briefly touched on in the artifact stats section, Skirk doesn't have too many attack buffs either in her kit or even externally through her team, outside of a few supportive artifact sets that you may be using. For those reasons, a weapon like Finale of the Deep that comes with a high base attack and also a ton of attack through its stat line and also its effect, provided you're running a healer, makes it an incredible stat stick on Skirk as a free-to-play option that you can craft and refine for free. On top of that, it's a weapon that also, for some reason, shares the same name as her signature set, which is a funny coincidence. And it's a weapon that is honestly really great for Skirk, being better than most 4-star options and even some of the 5-stars. With that said, Skirk also has another incredible free-to-play weapon if you are running a shielder instead. In fact, if you're running a shielder like Sitlali, Layla, Dahlia, or Diona, and can make sure your shield stays up, the Calamity of Eshu can also be a solid free-to-play weapon that we got through an event not too long ago. While you can't go back and get this weapon, if you already have it and are running a shielder, it can be surprisingly strong because it has a high base attack, and also when you're shielded will give your Skirk 40% normal and charge attack damage, as well as 16% crit rate for those normal and charge attacks. These are a lot of stats paired with the attack that you're gaining from its stat line, making it an even better option than Finale if you are shielded. Note that this is notably for a normal attacking playstyle. If you're using her for her burst damage, you are losing out on value from this weapon, and as we'll see in the weapon rankings, both these 4-stars, Calamity of Eshu and Finale of the Deep, won't be too far off other 5-star stat sticks outside of her signature, which makes them pretty great for Skirk. Calamity is a sword to be ran with a shielder, whereas Finale is a sword to be ran with a healer, and typically you'll have at least one of them. Outside of that, I lastly wanted to touch on the Battle Pass weapons, with Black Sword being viable for a main DPS Skirk playstyle, and Wolfang being viable for a burst damage one. Both of these weapons are fine and mainly better with high refinements, so you can use them if you have them and they suit your playstyle. Lastly, in case you're wondering about Harbinger of Dawn, it's not worth it on Skirk because the base attack is too low and your free-to-play options are better. Overall though, Skirk is someone who has a lot of good options, great 5-star stat sticks, and also great free-to-play weapons, and I will put 2 weapon rankings on screen now to help give you guys a general idea of what to expect. Now keep in mind that this will vary heavily based on your playstyle, with the left ranking being for a normal attacking Skirk and the right one being a more hybrid build where you're using your burst for damage but also swapping back in later and doing normal attacks, as this is more common than just using her purely for her burst. But if you don't use any normal attacks at all, then weapons that give you normal attack damage bonus like Haran or Eshu will rank lower. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Skirk's best constellations. Now you'll be happy to hear that while she doesn't need Constellations to be good, she actually does have some pretty strong early stopping points if vertical investment is the thing for you. First of all, Skirk's first constellation is one that will give her additional instances of cryo charge attack damage every time a Void Rift is absorbed. For each Void Rift absorbed, there will be a hit that scales with 500% of Skirk's attack, which is honestly quite a lot of motion value. And because you typically absorb around 6 Void Rifts, or sometimes 5, per rotation, this will add up to being a nice amount of bonus damage. Do keep in mind that because it's considered charge attack damage, ironically enough, it doesn't get buffed by her signature set, but does get buffed by sets like Marechaussee Hunter or even Desert Pavilion, which becomes more viable, with this honestly being a solid first constellation that just gives you a lot more damage regardless of your build or playstyle, because it's a lot of hits and the numbers are quite high. Similarly, Skirk's second constellation is also pretty comparable in strength, being a constellation that will buff both of her bursts. In fact, firstly, when Skirk uses her skill, C2 will give you another 10 Serpent Subtlety points, and then when you use your damage dealing burst, it will take into account 10 more Serpent Subtlety points for its damage, meaning that it will just have a bigger scaling. Outside of that, for her special burst, inside of her elemental skill, she will instead just gain 70% attack, which is a lot of stats. This constellation therefore will either give your burst more damage if you're using it for that, or will give you more attack, making it another really solid early constellation. Outside of that, Skirk's third and fifth constellation increase her talent levels, C3 increasing her burst level, and C5 increasing her skill level, with C4 giving her basically 40% attack for free, provided you are running a full Hydro and Cryo team. If not, you'll get a bit less. Lastly, for Skirk's sixth constellation, this is a wall of text that will basically just give her many more instances of damage, another big hit of burst damage when she's bursting, and more normal attack and also charge attack hits inside of her skill, basically just giving her more hits, more damage, with it seeming to be a pretty strong sixth constellation. Overall, Skirk's a character with good constellations, good early stopping points like C1 or C2, but also, as I said, being incredible even at C0, so you definitely shouldn't feel forced to get any constellations, and note that she also has other good ways to be invested into, like her signature weapon and support such as Escoffier. Do note that regarding her C1 versus her signature, both can offer you a relatively similar increase in damage, especially if you don't have a good weapon option. If you have a good 5-star though, then C1 will be a bigger increase, although for the most part, because they're pretty similar, I'd say it depends on you whether you want a constellation for your Skirk herself or want a weapon for your account, although given its effect, it's kind of tailor-made to Skirk. The real answer though will depend on your weapon options and also which of the banners make more sense for your account. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's get into one of the most important sections, which is regarding Skirk's best teams and synergies. Now, as you know by watching the video, Skirk is someone who is intertwined with the freeze reaction, meaning that all of her best teams will be freeze oriented. For those reasons, we're going to be talking about the best slots, the characters to run her with, and how to get the most value out of her, both in her main DPS and burst DPS playstyles, which typically share a very similar team building formula because you're going freeze. So with that said, here's what you need to know. Firstly, it is no secret that as far as freeze supports are concerned, Escoffier is the gold standard. She is basically the freeze support that I already touched on earlier in the video, as being a strong 3-in-1 res shredder, damage dealer, and also team-wide healer. For those reasons, Escoffier is invaluable to freeze teams, and the increase in team DPS she gives you is honestly second to none. While as we'll see, Skirk definitely has viable teams without Escoffier, I do want to highlight the fact that if you have Escoffier, definitely run her with your Skirk, as she definitely takes your teams to the next level, with Skirk and Farina typically increasing team DPS by around 30 or so %, but the exact number varies. Now with that said, both Escoffier and Skirk synergize very well with Farina, who's also a team-wide damage buffer, who has good Hydra application and personal damage as well. With that said, Farina is especially good if you do have Escoffier, because having a healer in your team that does so much for you on top of being a healer naturally makes someone like Farina, who gives you huge buffs at the cost of draining your HP and needing for it to be healed back up, a lot more efficient with a strong healer like Escoffier. With that said, if you have Escoffier but no Farina, still great to run her, so definitely do it. And if you have Farina but no Escoffier, you can run Farina with a different healer, anyone like Mika, Sejuani, or Kokomi. Now with that said, let's talk about the other Hydra and Cryo supports you can use as the last slot in this team, or when building a different team if you don't have Escoffier and or Farina. Firstly, I want to point out that if you have these three characters, your last slot can be one of quite a few different ones that all can perform relatively similarly depending on the content. Firstly, Shen is going to be kind of your standard cryo buffer, who works really well as she will just enhance your cryo damage significantly. Do note that while she does enable a sort of hybrid rotation, generally you'll just be either holding or tapping your skill to buff either your normal attacks or your burst. Now if you don't have her, obviously don't feel forced to get her, but she does work well here. Similarly, Yelan can perform very well, although keep in mind that if you're running double hydro, you will lose out on cryo resonance uptime, but Yelan still works really well as she'll increase your active character's damage while also having really good personal single target damage as well, being another excellent option. duration. Mona also works well in freeze teams as her Omen gives you a big damage buff, with the Omen's duration being extendable by the freeze reaction against frozen enemies. For those reasons, Mona can be really good as a damage amper who also can actually run Thrilling Tales instead of a Favonius energy recharge weapon if you have another Hydra in your team like Farina, which makes her get even more value than in most freeze teams where she's just the solo Hydro. Additionally, I wanted to point out that with her 4th constellation increasing crit rate, she will get even better. And a side note that her 1st constellation increasing freeze's duration is still bugged to my knowledge, which is sad. Outside of that, Sidlali can also be used as the last slot in this team as someone who can run the scroll set and also a buffing weapon like either Thrilling Tales or her signature. Now, I will say though that if you are running another cryo like Escoffier, triggering both the scroll set and Thrilling Tales can be very difficult, as you have to both trigger a reaction on Sidlali and then also swap into your Skirk directly after to give her the Thrilling Tales buff and also trigger the scroll set effect. For those reasons, you may have to swap your rotation out a bit or even change her weapon or artifact set. Obviously, if you have her signature or are playing a different team with more Hydro, then it's no problem, but managing to get both Thrilling Tales and Scroll alongside Farina and Escoffier can prove to be annoying and may require changing your build, changing your rotation, or even just giving up and giving your Escoffier the buff. Overall though, Sidlali is still a very strong unit as someone who doesn't need much field time and provides you with a fairly strong shield that could even allow you to run the Calamity of Eshu, a really strong free-to-play option if you don't have her signature or a good 5-star. Outside of that, on a similar but weird note, another Scroll Thrilling Tales character you can run is actually Moalani, who can proc it consistently. Now obviously, I get that it's weird to run a main DPS on a supportive set and weapon. Trust me, I know. And while I joked around with support Moalani with like Kanich just as a meme like almost a year ago, now this can actually work because she scales on HP, meaning that Thrilling Tales actually does buff her. And as long as you use your skill and do 1 hit of damage, Moalani can very rapidly trigger the scroll set, buff your cryo and Hydra damage for all your team, and also give Thrilling Tales to Skirk very easily. Outside of that, you can also use Moalani as another form of damage if you're playing Skirk in a burst playstyle, where you can then swap into Moalani and spend time on her. And even as a normal attacking Skirk, Moalani can either, at low investment, just use her skill, do a quick hit, and then swap out, or if you invest more into her, you can even use her burst to fill in any downtime by unleashing a small nuke of damage. For those reasons, while I don't expect most people to want to use their vape carry as a support or second DPS Moalani can actually work surprisingly well here. Lastly, another character you can use as more of a DPS if your Skirk is running a burst playstyle is going to be Neuvillette, who once again is getting another team. While obviously your Neuvillette won't have as much personal damage here, you can definitely run him alongside Skirk, who will help give you a bit more front-loaded burst damage in your rotation and allow Neuvillette to be your on-field carry. Lastly, I did want to mention other carries like even Ayaka, who can work as either a burst support with Skirk dealing damage or using Skirk as a burst damage dealer with Ayaka on field. Outside of that, you can technically run her with other Hydra or Crowd characters like even Ayato or Child, although that's less recommended. Outside of the 5-star characters that I just mentioned though, a 4-star like Xingqiu can honestly work fine, provided you build him correctly and invest into his damage, as he can do a good amount for a 4-star. Outside of that, other 4-star supports that can work include attack speed buffers like Mika or Dahlia, especially if you have Constellations on Dahlia. Both of these characters work for the attack speed that they give you, Mika giving more without Constellations and Dahlia giving more with them, with Mika giving you team-wide healing, which is very much appreciated, and Dahlia giving you a shield, which is great if you're running the Calamity of Eshu. Do note that attack speed's exact strength will vary based on how efficient you are at using it, how many more attacks you get, but do extend your rotation and give you more damage. Do note that while Dahlia's shield and attack speed is useful even at C0, it does get quite a bit better at C6, being a great 4-star option for Skirk. Outside of that, another healer you can run is going to be Charlotte as a cryo healer and Thrilling Tales holder, with Layla being another shielder you can use. Outside of that, Rosaria can work as a offensive 4-star support as well. Chongyun can be surprisingly viable because he has a bit of cryo res shred, attack speed, and technically cooldown reduction at C2, although that may or may not matter. Outside of that, Candace also increases your normal attack damage, and Kai is a free-to-play cryo choice who's okay. Now, as you can see, in these freeze teams, the sky really is the limit, with almost every Hydro and cryo character being viable. As I said, the best ones are going to be running Escoffier and Farina with a flex slot at the end. I'd say that Shenhe, Yelan, and Mona are the most quote-unquote standard, but if you have Sidlali available or Moalani, they definitely work as well, as Thrilling Tales and Scroll are both just really good. Outside of that, characters like Neuvillette or Ayaka work, 4-star supports like Xingqiu, Dahlia, and Rosaria as well, and for some example teams, well, here we go. Obviously, there's Farina Escoffier with any of the characters I just mentioned, and if you don't have Farina but have Escoffier, then you can once again mix and match any of the good characters together, whereas if you have Farina but no Escoffier, then while Farina won't be mandatory to use if you need her in your other team, she can still work well, just run another healer. The last slot in these teams will once again be a flex choice, and for teams without Escoffier or Farina, once again, there's premium options with 5-star characters like any of the ones we mentioned, or 4-star options like Dahlia, Rosaria, and Xingqiu, which is what I assume to be one of the standard free-to-play teams comprised of 4-star characters and Skirk. Outside of that, you can run double Hydra teams or really whatever you have available. Lastly, for some other team options, obviously Skirk as a burst DPS works with any of the Hydra or Cryo carries as I mentioned, and this basically concludes the freeze section. As far as other more cope options are concerned, I would not recommend playing her in Melt because it'll just be worse than the alternatives and you won't generate void rifts. And as far as non-Cryo or Hydro characters are concerned, in a Skirk freeze team, while losing out on the massive increase in scaling that she gets when her team is full Cryo and Hydro will typically just not be worth it. With that said, if you do have something like a C2 Shilonen, then you can run her. She will be competitive with some 4-star options and she'll be fine, but note that this is at C2 and you don't get as much value as you would running her in another team. Lastly, you can technically run Skirk as just a standalone unit to press her burst in other teams, although this really will not be optimal. Now with that said, we're now going to get into a showcase of my Skirk in the current Abyss 12. Now keep in mind that the current Abyss does give us normal attack damage bonus, so our normal attack numbers will be higher than usual, but our burst damage will be the same, and I can't properly show her off in the other half of the Abyss because some enemies have cryo shields or high cryo res. With that said, my Skirk is on a pretty good build. I did give her Mist Flitter despite having her signature weapon just to reduce her damage a little bit, but the damage is more than good enough. I am running her on 4-piece Maréchaussée Hunter because I have Farina in my team, with my Skirk obviously being C0, no Constellations active, and talent-wise, I did actually double crown her because 1, I love her, and more importantly, it's for another video that I recorded and that will be posted in a few days, so stay tuned for that. Although I typically don't instantly crown my characters, but it is what it is. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
My will embodied. Cryo incarnate. Paradise. At first, the sleep. Transfiguration. My ordinance divine. Night. Let my name go in song. A little of this boosh. At first, transfiguration. My ordinance divine. Extinguish my to will. Let me leave you out. Let's keep going, team. Finally. Into the force. Leave the wounded to me. Providing annihilate power. At first, the flavor. Cryo incarnate. Manifest. And never star goes out. Annihilate.
And so yeah, Skirk is a character that I genuinely really do like and I'm very happy with, and she's also surpassed my expectations as far as her strength goes. As I talked about earlier, she's someone who is restrictive and Escoffier is a broken support, but even just in general, even on her own, Skirk is an incredible character that I think you'll enjoy if you like her playstyle as someone who has very flexible rotations. Obviously, don't feel forced to get her or anything because there's a ton of strong DPSs, but with that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide. If there's anything you want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that as the character is new, and thanks so much for waiting for this video to be out. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.